Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for another Impact conversation. Today, I am so thrilled and honored to have Katie Cutting, the founder of Lazy Kitten Productions, joining us for a conversation around the importance of language. And Katie is somebody that I met about a year and a half ago on the set of a film. And Katie was so gracious in how she shared and educated and really just like allowed space for people to elevate their understanding in such a special way. And side note, unbelievable at teaching me how to properly fold, and it's not even fold, an extension cord. I still use those tricks to this day, Katie. So Katie, thank you for being here. I would love if you would share with everyone a little bit about yourself and your journey.
Thanks so much, Jocelyn. I love that you still use over under cable wrapping like I taught you.
You did, and I do.
Amazing. Yeah, so like you said, I'm an Edmonton-based filmmaker. I'm a photographer, storyteller, educator, and all-around social advocate. Most of my work centers around queer and trans issues. However, I've really been doing my best to raise the voices of Black, Indigenous, people of color within those spaces and with the tools that I have. And just to give you a little bit of work, I just finished a documentary that's going to be on TELUS Story Hive, which will be on TELUS Optic, and that is called Coffee to the People, which is about a queer Filipinx coffee shop here in Edmonton, Alberta, called Intent. Excuse me, called Intent Coffee. Sadly, Intent is closed now, but you gotta watch the film. So, yeah, but it's great to be here, and I'm glad to be part of the conversation.
Thank you. So, prior to us going into Solidarity Film Camp, you took the time to sit down with us and really have an important conversation around the language that we use when just in general. It doesn't even matter the communities that we are around, but because we need to ensure we're using inclusive language and language that's really respectful of everybody. And I learned so much in that, 2 hours and then the subsequent 4 or 5 days that we spent together. And I would love if you would just talk a little bit about that importance of language and, when it comes to pronouns and, the spectrum of gender language and those types of things. And also, please, if there is anything that I say while we're talking that I can learn from, that I can do better, I welcome the feedback as well. So I just want to put that out there as well.
Thanks. And honestly, like I know from our past interaction that you take feedback incredibly well, and that you're really open to it. But I think that is a really good point you make with regards to like the conversation that we had, at the beginning of that project. And this is something that I try to do, even though, I was one of many people involved in that project and on that team. One of the things that I try to bring into each of the spaces that I'm involved with is my tendency towards educating people. I love to talk, which is funny because I'm a huge introvert, but I love to info dump. And so being a huge like nerd about anything and everything, for me personally, when I came out as trans, that was actually one of the ways that I did a lot of my internal processing, was to kind of manage my own anxieties through being a teacher and being an educator. Most people, that's extra labor for them to do, right? And for me, one of the things that stood out right away was that the English language does not give us the tools to communicate effectively. in many situations. It it gives the tools for those, or it has only given usable tools to those who make them or take them, right? A good example of that is, earlier in the second half of the 20th century, little things like the shift towards inclusive job titles and language around, like, when you're talking about a general audience, talking about he or she instead of he, right? Or talking about police person or police officer instead of policeman. But one of the things that obviously leads out is a large swath of the community that doesn't really fit under male or female, or in a lot of ways, that's just down to the history of our society. Our Western European society is what I like to think of it as. One thing before talking about language, I think it's really important to talk about why we view gender the way we do, because in a lot of ways, like, transness in one way, shape, or form has been around for as long as humans have been around. And if you look back over history, you see that while the large portion, or the large large majority of people have fallen under male or female, and who are cisgender, which is the word for folks who stick with the gender or identify with the gender that they're assigned at birth, while cis folks are the vast majority, there are always these little pockets, these little stories that creep up, whether it's through mythology, whether it's through someone being buried with, the opposite gender's clothing or that sort of thing. These stories come to us in our present day, and we look back and go, oh wow, that was really transgressive of them. And what we don't know is how normal it was, how regular it was. But what we do know is that if we look towards, like, the Victorian era, that was kind of the era where Western European culture took over the world, right, through colonialism. And that colonial act ended up using gender as a method of control. So this was where, I was actually just refreshing it this morning, and I actually didn't know this, but pre-Victorian era, it was quite regular in Europe for women to work alongside their husbands. It was quite regular for people to just not care, right? And that's where I've heard that from a lot of people. I'm like, oh, I just want to ignore gender. I'm like, cool, we did that before. And then what happened is the Victorian era came in, and we got very segregated as a society, through gender, through race, through sexuality, through all of these things. And it was largely as a method of control, whether it was in place by the governments of the day or the church or both. And it was also used to control the colonized peoples. So a good example that I learned about during my recent film project is, like, the Filipino culture pre Dutch and Spanish intervention was largely, the language was largely without gendered terminology. And that's something that we, as Western European cultures or powers, brought in. My ancestors, the Dutch, brought in this strong idea of a gender binary. And while, yeah, there was little bits of it here and there, we really enforced it. And now to the point where you have a very entrenched conservative view of such things in that particular country, and in many colonized countries around the world. So all of that to say, that our current understanding of gender expression, of gender roles, is not set in stone. It is not really ancient, and it has no further history than to maybe 300 years.
Wow.
And I think that that context is very, very important when we look at language. When we look at talking about inclusive language, and we look at talking about building a just world, right? So when you start with a context that really it's all made up. And I say that because one of the biggest arguments that people tend to make, who are either unsure or are vehemently against the use of newer pronouns or changing their language at all, is they say, oh yeah, those are just made up words. But the fact of the matter is, language follows the people. It follows the society. And why we're seeing the rise or the return of inclusive language, or the specific creation of inclusive language, is because society is asking for it. Society needs it. So I know that's like this whole like precursor to the conversation about inclusive language itself. But again, I think it's really important to have that context, and to remember that we can look back at history and people have changed their views on everything every 200 years or so.